Statement of Leo Blythe, historian and curator at the Old River State Park and Preserve and Old River National Heritage Area, providing a short overview as to its history. Statement given directly from subject, December 3rd, 2015. Statement begins. The Old River Park and Preserve, or Old River Park as it is more commonly known, protects the resources, waters, and designated spaces vital to that of the Old River. While the river itself runs for hundreds of miles and originates in the Carolinas, the site currently managed is approximately 73 miles in length and varies in width along the river, encompassing more than 100,000 square acres in size. From the snow-capped peaks of the Golgotha Mountains to the temperate forests and lush greenery of the lower rapids, the park enjoys a wide variety of environments and microclimates which make it one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Today, nearly 500,000 visitors come to the park annually to see the sights, fish, hunt, and most predominantly partake in outdoor recreation like hiking, camping, canoeing, whitewater rafting, rock climbing, and base jumping. While much of this is handled by private outfitters, as a National Heritage Area and State Park, there is a joint responsibility between federal, state, and local agencies and businesses to keep everything running smoothly. Still, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so we should probably start from the beginning. Now let's see. Our story begins millions of years ago with tectonic plates crashing together, uplifting the rock and stone that would form the Appalachian Mountains. Older than recorded history, they are silent witness to the entirety of all humanity, and will likely outlive us yet. Still, they have provided shelter and a vitally important ecosystem that would eventually draw people to the region. The native peoples, most notably the Cherokee, called these lands home, hunting, gathering, fishing, and living here until the arrival of Europeans. With their arrival and the advent of what was called the Great Dying, disease claimed the lives of approximately 54 million people across the Americas, and the pristine, untouched woods, unquote, those European settlers discovered, were actually maintained by generations through prescribed burns and... I am getting off topic. If you would like to learn more about the different indigenous peoples who lived in the area, you can listen to one of my other lectures or enroll in one of my classes. Anyway, the Old River Preserve is, as the name suggests, a very old river. No one is entirely sure who named it, but for millennia now, this now 200-mile-long river cut a gorge through the mountains, bringing up warm water from the south to Virginia, where it creates a varied and unique ecosystem, before depositing into New Crater Lake and eventually the Mississippi River. Now, something you need to understand. The Cherokee were a very powerful and influential tribe in the region at the time. To give you an idea, their emissaries met personally with both King George II and King George III. Yes, that King George for all you Revolutionary War enthusiasts out there, to discuss more formal diplomatic relations between Britain and the Cherokee peoples, as well as hunting rights and grounds. Deerskin had become such a lucrative and important material that the skin of the males, or bucks, remains synonymous with wealth to this very day. The lands here were part of those hunting grounds, but white settlers were not keen on letting the status quo remain, and through a myriad of constructed reasons ranging from divine prominence to simple greed, began to take that which didn't belong to them. This would pose a bit of a problem, and the British government after the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, made the line of expansion the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonists from expanding further into Cherokee territory. The colonists, not enthusiastic about being told what to do by a bunch of aristocrats across the ocean, for the most part ignored this at best. Things would hit a fever pitch shortly before the Revolutionary War, both between the native people and amongst the colonists themselves. The area was heavily fractured into loyalists, favoring staying loyal to the crown, and patriots, who sought independence. Staying neutral was decidedly not tolerated. Lines were drawn, families and friendships broke, and there are dozens upon dozens of accounts of neighbors, friends, families descending on one another in a fit of butchery and, well, slaughter. While native tribes are decentralized and not necessarily homogeneous, a fair number of them under Dragon Canoe would help the British during the War for Independence, hoping the British government would honor the land claims. The native people were rather effective fighters, and the Cherokee launched several attacks in the region and in particular targeted those patriots who favored independence. Provincial leaders, unwilling to let this stand and wanting to secure these lands for themselves, were prompted into delivering a massive retaliation. The colonists mustered thousands of militia, or citizen soldiers, and descended upon the Indian villages along the river. Accounts from the time are bloody, chaotic, and graphic. The rivers ran red, and whoever wasn't slain was sold into slavery. The few that were left tried to go on with their lives after the war, but with Britain no longer able to honor the claims on land and subsequent United States policy on Indian removal, they were effectively wiped out from the area. The location of several of these villages have either been purposefully or accidentally left to be forgotten, and every now and then a visitor to the park will turn up with a projectile point or musket ball which can be traced back to the time period. Now, in the 1820s and 30s, while somewhat remote, many folks began to settle along the river. While the rapids and waters made traversing difficult at points, it could still be used for passage and plantations began to crop up. Combined with the growing coal and logging industry and a railway through the region, it looked like a spot of genuine opportunity, so long as you were a white man, that is. Slavery was common, and slave labor was used in both field and home. Census records indicate that approximately a fifth to a quarter of the population at the peak was enslaved, although these populations were typically concentrated on and around the plantations. The area depended heavily on the labor and products produced by the enslaved, and the cotton, rice, and tobacco grown there would ultimately prove to be part of the downfall. The presidential election of 1860 would be one that defined the nation. Abraham Lincoln, promising to stop the spread of slavery and prevent new slave states from being admitted to the country, was a death knell to the, quote, peculiar institution upon which slave states so heavily relied. Rather than wait for a slow and steady fall down the line, the slaveholders and their allies thought it would be better if they instead left. They rebelled, forming the Confederate States of America, and declared their independence, seeking to form a new nation where slavery would be ever permitted. The northern states, having had enough, decided they would not let the southern states leave, and so we have the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, Slaveholders' Rebellion, War between the states, among many other names, from 1861 to 1865. An important part of this conflict is the famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, March to the Sea orchestrated by General Sherman. He instituted a form of total war. Burn everything in your path, break not just their armies and men before you, but to shatter the very will of the people to go on. Leave nothing in your calamitous wake but despair, burnt-out homes, and stifling silence. Devastating, but quite effective. You can understand why he remains to this day a bit of a divisive figure. While General Sherman never came here, an officer inspired by his example did. The records themselves are incomplete and conflicting in what happened those days, or even who was there. Supposedly, it was the 15th Rhode Island Infantry Regiment and 17th Battery Massachusetts Light Artillery Regiment, but that poses several problems already, given that there are few pieces of information to suggest they actually existed at all. Regardless, they, or at least a group purporting to be them, arrived in February of 1865 under the command of Brigadier General Jonas Bryant. They collapsed the coal mines with men still trapped inside, twisted the railways around trees and buildings, and employed in a very literal sense scorched earth tactics. At the town of Hambrook they shelled the buildings including the hospital and set everything ablaze. The fire destroyed in an instant trees that towered over the landscape for hundreds of years, and the ash was so thick the sun could not be seen by some accounts for days. It is also one of the largest incidents of friendly fire on American soil. Both Confederate and Union forces fell on each other and themselves in a violent and horrific display. This continued for a week until, with his own forces depleted and having massacred and destroyed most of the region, what was left of Bryant's men departed for Savannah and absorbed into other regiments and units, though the Brigadier General himself disappeared and was never seen again. Understandably, people were reluctant to come forward with their stories, and much of it is still shrouded in mystery. In the span of a single week, one of the most up-and-coming communities was almost completely destroyed, never to fully recover. The area, towns, and bodies were all left to be reclaimed by nature, and this section of the old river was left untouched and abandoned for nearly 70 years. The 1930s were a time of both great hardship and change in the nation. The Great Depression had ruined the financial fortunes and prospects of many, but desperate times called for desperate measures. With the 1932 election delivering a referendum on the status quo, the people put their faith in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was willing to radically expand and change the nature of his office as president to get the job done. He promised a new deal for the American people in the form of several programs and bills to alleviate the struggling economy, and one of them was the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. The purpose was to take all the young men who felt abandoned by the system, without work or food, and give them the opportunity to work outdoors and earn their keep. They created trails, clearings, lodges, and in the process, parks across the nation. While parts of the current park and preserve were not touched by the CCC, nearly all the areas the public attend today were the result of their planning and projects. The overlooks, visitor centers, and Castle Tower were all originally built and maintained by these young men with hope in their hearts and shovels in their hands. Work stalled with the outbreak of World War II, but afterwards the U.S. emerged from the conflict as a dominant leader, wielding the destructive power of a split atom for all the world to see. With money, homes, and most importantly cars, Americans sought to enjoy the fruits of their labors with a more relaxing pastime. With this, parkways and parks exploded in popularity, and the collection of sites along the river were jointly christened the Old River Park by these vacationers. In 1955, the park hosted the National Scout Jamboree. Boy Scouts from all across America were invited to partake in a summer of all manner of activities ranging from swimming, rafting, team building, zip-lining, forest and trail work, hiking, and, of course, the Great Camp Championship Games. It was such a massive success that they hosted again from 1957 to 1966. In the summer of 1960, there was one of the largest Civil War encampments in the nation at the time, drawing in more than 8,000 reenactors. I will note it appears most of them were farbs, also known as polyester soldiers, which hit the sweet uncanny valley of just historically accurate enough to nearly resemble parody. Still, the carnival-like atmosphere of it helped further revitalize the landscape and encourage some movement back into the area, as men clad in mostly gray but some blue uniforms performed drill and at times even mock battles to the delight of the viewing public. It seems like after decades of misfortune, the old river was finally beginning to turn it around, at least until the disappearances. In 1963, camp counselor Evelyn Miller disappeared going out for a walk by Schiff Pond. There were many rumors in camp that she had run off with her lover, a black man she was seen talking to earlier. This was thought to be a Romeo and Juliet situation, and the authorities decided to cover it up rather than look further. However, at the end of the season, Maria Carmichael and her brother Jake went missing for a week. Maria reappeared, covered in webs and weeping, simply whispering, "Mr. Spider said not to tell," over and over. Jake was never found. The misnamed 13th Texas Infantry Reenactors Corps also thought they found, quote, "a battlefield lost to time," and several members foolishly went searching for it, and predictably were never seen again. In 1964, 4 children went missing when they said they were checking out the old church and burying ground on a dare, and the 5th was found rocking back and forth with a flashlight gripped so tightly their nails had bent and torn. Psychological reports after said that they could not tolerate being left alone in darkness and needed to have the lights on or break into fits of terrible sobbing screams. By the end of the 1964 season, the press had seized on the story of the park being very much haunted by something, and between the investigations and subsequent lawsuits, suspended their 65 season for additional training, security, and preventative measures. While the 1966 Jamboree did occur, attendance was significantly lower than normal, and there was a pervasive fear which permeated the campgrounds. 1967 and 68, it was revealed the park leadership had engaged in gross acts of fraud, and furthermore knowingly built significant portions of the parking lots and some buildings across both native and soldier burial grounds. This was, of course, met with widespread condemnation, and a few careers ended because of it. To this day, I am still shocked that no one ended up in prison. However, after a reconsolidation and change in leadership in 1970, there were a handful of smaller events which tried to right the ship. Unfortunately, the damage was already done, and by 1974 they declared bankruptcy and closed their doors. The park wouldn't be completely forgotten. In 1982, it was given additional protective status, being included as part of a National Heritage Area, and while closed off from much of the public, the 2 beaches that were still accessible received some funding through the federal government. This generated some measure of renewed interest in the old park, and with the release of the popular horror flick Slasher Camp in 1992 and its sequel in 1993, both shot on location, overnight the roads began to teem with cheap spooky houses, haunted tours, urban explorers, and all manner of other tourist traps. In 1994, the Old River, while it had been called a park for decades, was officially designated as a state park and preserve, with the purpose being to protect its vibrant ecosystem. That wasn't why most people flocked to its shores, though. It was already beginning to suffer from an influx of visitors with an eye towards the occult. In 1995, the third and most successful of the Slasher Camp series was released with a larger budget and, if I'm being wholly honest, some really excellent camera work, making use of zip lines and underwater footage. The plot is only marginally less paper-thin than its predecessors, but nevertheless it delivers some good scares and a few genuinely surprising twists in both narrative and genre. It was also the last of the films to be shot on location for several years, as they never actually got their permits in order, and it later came out Horny Dane Productions had bribed a few folks to look the other way while they were filming. The Academy Award-nominated romantic comedy The Jamboree of '63, based around the Scout Jamborees of the 1950s and 60s, tells the fictionalized tale of 2 star-crossed teens who overcome racial barriers and oppression in the name of love. Many with even a loose familiarity with the story have pointed out that the lead's name, Lynn, is a thinly veiled allusion to Evelyn Miller, drawing inspiration from the story of her disappearance. Despite protests from the Miller family, whose movie counterparts are, shall we say, less than charitably painted, it has become a classic over the years and further generated another wave of tourism. It also renewed interest from those who were now aging but fondly remembered the camp, culminating in a revival movement for the campgrounds. This led to the park getting national attention by the year 2000 as one of the up-and-coming hidden gem destinations, and thus received a series of grants and budgetary bumps totaling almost $18.2 million over the next 5 years. Unfortunately, among the many things 9/11 disrupted, the larger plans for a grand state park were thoroughly derailed. Funding dried up, backers pulled out their investments, and many of the dreams of revitalization remained just that, dreams. The years of war in the Middle East ticked away, although we did have a few beaches, campgrounds, and most notably, an overlook complete with, for some god-forsaken reason, a farce of a replica castle which, despite my notable protests, Moira says, is here to stay. Oh, and a fire tower of all things. The most noteworthy addition was the creation of a ranger outpost in both the northern and southern portions of the park, as well as redoing some of the more prominent trails so they were accessible and easy to navigate. Many old trails remain to this day, worn, washed out, and faded, but still used. Eliza also started the trend of base jumping and bungee jumping off the old bridges and mountaintops. I expressed concern at first given her family ties, but thus far it appears Miss Fairchild is behaving herself, and my worries were for nothing. It is because of this she was picked up as the Recreation and Natural Resources Lead, as I was offered the park historian and curator position. We were given broad freedom under a series of revolving superintendents, as no one actually wanted that job, as well as a small staff of seasonal help that fluctuated over the years. 2010, our budget was slashed and most of the seasonal help was let go, but an expose in 2012 highlighted how dire our lack of funding had become, that we rangers were basically unable to do any level of real monitoring of the park. Uplifting us as an example, renewal became part of Senator Carl Billings' election strategy for revitalizing tourism of the state, and he not so subtly implied he would flood the public spaces with much of his own wealth if that's what it took. He spent almost $30 million of his own money to run as an independent and fractured enough of the vote that he won the seat. While many politicians are noted for their ability to conveniently forget promises made during an election cycle, He surprised us last year with a check for $25 million for fixing up the park. We've spent much of that money on critical infrastructure repairs, building up campgrounds, a new ranger outpost, repaving main roads, as well as what I hope, despite her misgivings about historically inaccurate towers, is our first proper competent superintendent, a Dr. Moira Woloski. We also brought on board new staff, including a wildfire management specialist and biologist, ironically named Pyrrha Burns. I had initially, given her disposition, understandably strong reservations about her position, but she too has since proven herself as someone we can trust. We also posted openings for surveying work, archaeological inquiries, engineering, historians, protection and security rangers, a nurse, plus a few more nondescript positions, although we are still waiting for those jobs to be filled. The park isn't the size of Yellowstone, and despite the headwinds and new staff, there is still so much work that needs to be done. I suspect that Senator Billings wishes to restore the park to the halcyon days of his youth, when he was a wide-eyed scout bringing his troop to victory in the camp games. But, Section 106 archaeological compliance aside, there is still much buried here that would prefer to stay that way. It also appears our counterparts, for lack of better word, at the Magnus Institute across the pond are having a bit of a moment. Something is coming, and despite my status, I am but one man who can only be in one place at one time. Liz, Pyrrha, and to a limited extent, Moira and I have been talking, and all agree we will need some more hands for things to go smoothly, or at least as close to smoothly as I can get. We flew the position a few weeks ago, and I have a stack of candidates for the job. Now it's just a matter of picking those who will best suit our needs. I am torn. They do not know what they may be signing up for, and while I hope they never do, hope is not the patron that sustains me, and I have been let down by hope before. Needless to say, this year should prove to be, at the very least, interesting. Dr. Leo Blythe, historian and curator for the Old River Preserve State Park and National Heritage Area. Statement ends. Hello, Leo here. Just a few things before we say goodbye. First and foremost, The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. The characters, settings, and intellectual property of the Magnus Archives belongs to them, not me, and I encourage all of you to support the official release. Especially as the Magnus Protocol is coming out, and it sounds like that's going to be pretty cool too. This episode was produced by me for my channel, Leo Blythe, and is part of an upcoming campaign setting. I'm developing as I'm learning the Cypher system, and the Magnus Archives Roleplaying Game is coming out. They just wrapped up their Kickstarter, and it looks like it was a resounding success. I am not making this for profit or monetary compensation. If you really want to kind of support this stuff, go over to the folks at Rusty Quill. They have a lot of cool stuff on their Patreon and other things, so really go and check them out. I'm just doing this for the thrill of spooks and sharing some of my ideas and experiences that I've had over the years, kind of working for the parks, and using that as the backdrop for what I'm hoping will be a pretty nifty campaign setting. And I will admit this is the first time I'm really kind of delving into something like this, so I apologize if the audio quality is not exactly stellar. I'm planning on picking up a mixer and some more technological know-how and maybe a new mic sometime around the holidays. And hopefully that makes the listening experience a smidgen more pleasant between now and the next recording that I do. So I hope that you all have a great day and a wonderful holiday season. And I was informed by a friend of mine that if this does take off in popularity, or even if it doesn't, John, if you're listening, I was told that I had to say this. I apologize for thinking that your character was a muscle-bound, like, gym rat for, like, all of Season 1. I don't know how that idea got in my head. I just really thought that John was ripped, and then we got to the finale, and that became obviously not the case. But anyway, hope that you're doing well, and that, yeah. Anyway, have a wonderful holiday season. I will be back in the eventual future with some more stuff. So keep your eyes posted. And yeah, take care. See you later.